Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, I share a clip from an interview with Dr. Nay, conducted with me as part of her support group for women recovering from trauma bonds and seeking healing. Together, we delve into the complexities of narcissism, discussing its roots in developmental trauma, the characteristics of malignant narcissism, and the unique challenges of treating individuals with these traits. Our conversation also explores the dynamics of relationships with narcissists, touching on the roles of hope, projection, and implicit relational enactments. And don't worry, I know that sounds like a complicated concept, but she and I together, we break that down. Dr. Nay brings very thoughtful questions that lead us into a rich discussion about the importance of differentiation in relationships and the potential for change. Let's turn now to that conversation that sheds light on the emotional complexity of trauma bonds. I hope you find this as insightful and useful as I did.
He helps his patients overcome both acute and long-standing problems that may be more embedded in their personality. And so, Dr. Mazzella, I'm so excited to have you here today for many reasons, but you're somebody who speaks my language. And, you know, with so many survivor-turned-experts on social media, right, it can get a little troublesome when you see people who talk about things that are very complex.
Yes.
Right? And that they don't get the full breadth of it. And so, you know, this community, just so you know, is full of women who are either in trauma bonds or who have left their trauma bonds and they're looking to heal. So I know that you're an expert in narcissism.
Yes.
Right? Which we talk a lot about here. And so can you give us your definition of narcissism and how it really differentiates from somebody who just has like narcissistic traits, but then a true personality disorder?
Sure. So again, this is coming from more of a psychodynamic perspective, not just like the bullet points in the DSM,
Yes.
right?
Love it.
So one of the main distinguishing criteria is what we call the grandiose sense of self. And that goes far beyond what most people think about when they think of grandiosity. Like if I ask everybody in this room, like what comes to mind about grandiosity, most likely it's like, you know, arrogance, the need to be the center of attention. They over-exaggerate their accomplishments, and all of these things are true, right? So this is sort of the core structure of the narcissistic personality. But there's also the corollary. There's the other side, which is also the grandiose sense of self, which is part of it is there's also an acute sense of vulnerability, right? Mm-hmm. There's a more desperate, believe it or not, needy, clingy side to the personality as well. Mm-hmm. And what you see in someone who has this characteristic is sort of an oscillation. They oscillate between, they could be very grandiose at one moment, right? And then very vulnerable, needy, clingy, insecure at the next. And even there are moments when they both present together. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about that as well. But so yes, the main defining characteristic is the grandiose sense of self, which is the arrogance, but it's also the vulnerability. And it's that dismissive quality that often comes along when you think of narcissism and the lack of empathy and the other things that typically one would consider.
Right, right. You know, and it can go all the way up to a malignant narcissist.
Yeah,
right?
So the way, again, just from a psychodynamic perspective, the way I think about that is there are different clusters or types of narcissistic presentations. So the malignant type is one of those. Now, all the different clusters, the grandiose, what we call the phallic narcissist, like look at me, the vulnerable, the covert, and then there's the malignant. Now, in all of them, the one common characteristic actually is the grandiose structure. It is the need for still to get what we call narcissistic supplies. I'm sure everybody's heard of that. But each one of the clusters just gets the supplies in a different way. The malignant narcissist happens to get it through what? Being overly aggressive, right? That's how they feel good about themselves.
Yeah. I like that. They all need narcissistic supply, but they go about it, getting it in a different way. And I think that
Yes.
that's an important differentiation. I run a bunch of support groups in here,
Mm-hmm.
and we were talking about, the origins and the developmental trauma that would lead someone to be narcissistic. And can you explain what some of those, what are some of the family of origin experiences that create
Yes.
someone?
Yeah, like if you're thinking about like your prototypical, like just the run of the mill, garden variety, narcissistic personality, right? Not like the malignant, because the malignant, in my opinion, and I think probably most people in this room may have had more experience with the malignant type, so
Yes.
they may want to go into that more. But just in general, most narcissists grow up in the family where their needs are not met, their needs are not recognized,
Mhm.
and they develop what's called a false sense of self. I mean, I could go into a bigger theory about it, but I think a clinical example is just much easier to sort of
Okay.
wrap our mind around it. Picture the little girl who comes home after school and she just completed an art project and she's so excited to show it to her parent, right? Let's just say her mother in this example, and her mother dismisses it quite quickly, doesn't really show any interest in it. Now, on the surface, this is not traumatic, right? But it's thought that when some people call it little t, like little trauma, but when they add up, when they're consistent enough, right, that over time, the good, loving, caring, responsive, a parent who can respond what we call affect resonance or emotional attunement is not there. That goes missing.
Right.
And what happens when that goes missing, and same thing with the little boy, for example, who scrapes his knee and comes home crying, if they don't have a parental figure who can match that level of intensity, that level of affect, at least initially, because you don't want two people dysregulated. That's not going to help either. Now we're more in what's called the borderline realm of personality disorders, but someone who can match it at least initially.
Yeah.
So they feel understood, like, oh, that's horrible. Let me take a look at your knee, but then slowly bring it down. This is what we call the act of containment, by the way, if we start thinking about treatment, which maybe we'll discuss later.
Mhm.
But then they contain the emotion so the child feels both seen, recognized, deeply understood, and then contained. So
Yeah.
I was saying, when enough of that doesn't happen, the child then has a very different experience, because you can imagine they come home affectively aroused. They need somebody to help them regulate their inner world, give a name to what's going on inside of them. And unfortunately, the experience then is one of what? Like mom can't be bothered, or dad says, stop being a sissy. It's just a scrape on your knee. So now their whole internal world begins to change. And yes, this really happens at this early of an age. And there's research to demonstrate that. Again, later, if we want, I could talk about some of the research experiments of where they study, it's called child observation. You may know about this, actually.
Yeah.
You may have seen some of this. Yeah.
Yeah, so you said two really important things there that I want to touch on, because I teach a course here, and in the emotional regulation part, I talk about being able to see, recognize, name, and contain your emotion.
Yes.
Right. So I'm teaching everyone how to do what wasn't done for you, right? Because we have to learn how to do that ourselves, and just how important that is to not judge our own emotions, to not dismiss our own emotions, right? To not shame our own emotions, which brings me to shame, because when often the child feels deep shame when the parent doesn't mirror their affect, right?
Yes.
When the parent doesn't soothe them. Yeah. Okay, so that's wonderful, because it's exactly what we're talking about. And then I want to ask about, what about the malignant narcissist? Because a lot of the women here are dealing with the malignant narcissist, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, that sort of dark tetrad individual. So why don't we focus on malignant narcissists?
Yeah. So where do we begin? In my opinion, aside from the covert, which is really difficult to treat, the malignant is like almost impossible to treat. And it really depends on the extent to which they have the antisocial personality traits. Now, all malignant narcissists do have antisocial, and you know about this, right?
Yeah.
Dr. Nate, yeah. So It depends on the extent and how much they dominate the personality, because obviously the more antisocial characteristics they have, which include what? Lying, stealing, cheating, like these things, breaking the law, really abusive, no regard for others, no regard for society. So the more of those traits they have, the lower the prognosis, like positive prognosis, that is.
Right.
So in other words, the more it's harder to treat them and expect bigger change when you're dealing with that kind of personality.
You know, that's always the biggest question in here, right? Because when you have cognitive dissonance in this group, we call the pathological personality Romeo and Dirty John, because when you meet them, they're loving and kind, and then the mask falls and they become Dirty John, or this malignant narcissism, psychopathy comes out, right? And so the biggest question is that, you know, sometimes cognitive dissonance gives you a little hope, like they're going to go back to that Romeo. But I try to explain when they're at that level of pathology of the malignant narcissist psychopathy, they're really, like you're saying, there's not a positive prognosis. They don't change.
Dr. Nate, let me say one thing about that very quickly, because I don't know if it's for anybody in this group. It may not apply, but it's certainly in my practice and what I see, you know, in talking to a lot of these people, is when you just said they go back to the hope, that in itself is a big part of the problem. So being with somebody who has this characteristic, this malignant trait of the narcissist, right? Narcissistic cluster, is a big part of the problem. But the other part of the problem, believe it or not, is the hope that they could change. And there's a whole theory on this that's dating back like to the 1970s, but it's called a shared unconscious fantasy. And that's oftentimes what keeps people trapped in these relationships. It's not that they love the person. They think they love the person. They're convinced that they do, but they really don't. They love what they think or hope that that person will offer to them. Because oftentimes, and again, this is only in people, again, not in this room, I don't know, but people who are really struggling to move forward in life and put this behind them and really mourn a loss and move forward. Because oftentimes what I hear when I talk to people is they leave this kind of relationship, they finally muster up the courage to get out, and it's wonderful. And then they say to me, but then I ended up in another abusive relationship, or I ended up going back to the person who was abusive towards me.
Yeah, and I listened to one of your podcasts where you talk about the illusion, the reality versus the fantasy, but I had never heard this of this shared unconscious fantasy, and that's like another lens to look at cognitive dissonance through, and where hope is the hook, is that it is a fantasy. And I just love that term. It's just really, it just gives us, we love terms and words in here because we just want to learn. And this is what they're all struggling with the most, is this shared unconscious fantasy.
Yes.
Because this person was initially presented a certain way.
Yeah. And it's a funny thing because when I discuss it, I never know how it's going to land. But I was recently doing an interview like this, and I mentioned it to the woman interviewing me. And then she disclosed something very personal, which was after she left her narcissistic, abusive husband, she said, I ended up in my next 3 subsequent relationships with men who were pathologically or narcissistically disturbed. So
and that's why we have this community, because that is not going to happen again. Right? So that's why we have this. So there's so many ways that we can go with this, but we talked in our group last night, and since this is really your area of expertise, when I wrote my book, even though I'm trained in, you know, Jungian Freudian stuff, I also looked at the woman's personality traits to not pathologize her, right? So I used the 5-factor model of personality, because the research showed a lot of women that have agreeableness and conscientiousness, which is me, they end up as perfect prey for these. But last night we were talking about how, though, early developmental trauma for the female, right, can put us into like an implicit relational enactment.
Yes.
With this person. And can you speak to that?
Well, I was just going to ask you to speak to that. That's a big concept, implicit relational enactment. And I think I know what it means, because I certainly know what enactments are.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Just a reenactment of their childhood. Yeah. Yeah,
but wait, let's think about it. Let's slow it down, because what's actually getting reenacted? I just want to make sure I understand the way you're using it.
You know what I think is getting reenacted? The intermittent reinforcement, the intermittent inconsistency.
Okay, fair enough. Yep, that's exactly right. It's the intermittent reinforcement, which then leads or leaves open the door for what? Back to that word we used a moment ago, hope. There's the hope again, right? But the
Right.
hope is based on an illusion, right? An illusion that we're going to have this intense togetherness, that they're finally going to see me. They're finally going to recognize me in a way that went missing earlier in development or was only there periodically, to your point, Dr. Nay. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was listening to a podcast that you did where you were explaining, so we talk about in a trauma bond, there's two things. There's a power imbalance and intermittent reinforcement. And so one of the pathological partner or the malignant narcissist really wants to have power and control over the other.
Hmm.
What I liked the way I heard you explain it is that also the pathological lover has a lot of trouble allowing their partner to be different, to be
Yes.
separate, to have
Yeah.
autonomy. Can you speak to that?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for saying that, because it's so easy to say, let's just to keep it very simple. The husband in this, prototypical example needs to control the woman, right? But here's the paradox. It's mutual control. They are both controlling one another.
Mhm.
And that's not oftentimes looked at or thought about. And again, part of the problem, and that's why these things get repeated, what we spoke about a moment ago, how they end up in another relationship, because you never really work through that. So everybody has to try to be really careful if you can. It's hard to do this, but to really think about what was the interpersonal dynamic that was at play to keep this relationship alive. I really need to understand that so that I don't repeat it again in my next relationship. So how does the wife, again, in this example, the woman, the wife, how do they control? Well, they control because remember, they too are invested in this illusion of togetherness. They too are looking to symbiose, have a symbiotic relationship.
Mhm.
So they are never really relating to the man as a real, whole, separate, individuated person. They relate to him in a way that they need to see him, but they don't even know they're doing this, nor does he, by the way. It's not always so conscious. Sometimes it is, maybe more so with the malignant type.
Mhm.
Most don't think, they just think, finally, salvation. I found someone who really understands me, and this is wonderful. So then there's that promise, that false hope. But anyway, yeah, so they are both, maybe not mutually, but they're both sort of in this thing together, hoping that the other person, that they will feel fulfilled in a way that's been missing since early childhood.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And, I don't know if you know David Schnark's work. He wrote the book A Passionate Marriage. He's so lovely, but he talks about this very thing in that, of course, in a trauma bond, this pathological malignant narcissist has probably more of a difficult time with it than a more high functioning neurotic,
Yes.
right? Like myself, right? So
Hmm.
to speak, but that they really have a hard time with the differentiation, with the separateness. And
Yes.
what I really loved about your work when I listened to it, and we haven't really talked about it here, and I want to bring it up, and you touched on it a little bit there, is that when we fall in love, we do become enamored with merging with that person, becoming
Hmm.
one, right? The symbiotic feeling,
Yes.
right? And then that's so hard to deal with being differentiated.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing to marital conflict, I work with couples as well, and it's so hard because it goes under the radar. Like what you typically tend to focus on is the explosion, the anger, the withdrawal, the drug addictions, the cheating. But oftentimes when you get really close to these people and you ask inquisitive questions, you don't have a preconceived agenda. Like you're not trying to save a marriage or separate somebody. What you begin to hear are the everyday separations of life are painfully difficult for them.
Yeah.
And rather than tolerate and work through, because these are many losses, as you can imagine, every time somebody leaves, it's a loss. But if you cannot tolerate loss, a fight, a conflict is a really good way to put a patch on it, right? Because now in a conflict, I know it seems so paradoxical, but you're back together. She's thinking about you, you're thinking about her. And it's not kind of a magical togetherness like I was describing earlier, but nevertheless, it's a really important way to be deeply connected with somebody.
Right. in this community here, I'm all about education. So I'm teaching them about their personality traits, about their attachment patterns, right? About their developmental trauma, so they can see their whole constellation of who they are, right? The defenses they came up with, the behaviors they came up with due to their early developmental trauma. And it's so important because there are often these unconscious dynamics.
Yes.
Like mice in the attic running the show.
Yeah, and that's one of the advantages of being in a group like this, right? Or in your own therapy with someone who's really trained to recognize these unconscious processes, because they'll see it and then help you begin to see it. So, because these things are so subtle. Again, I love examples. I'll just give a very quick example because I think that's where the rubber meets the road, right?
Yeah.
So a woman comes in and she's talking about how there was a disagreement with her husband about the way they're going to raise their child, right? And she's talking about this, and then suddenly she's telling me about, you could fill in the blank here, how wonderful the weekend was together, or how he's so narrow-minded and he can't even consider her perspective. But the most important thing, the way that I work with her, is I began to, when I could slow this down and I could say to her, can we go back over this again? You were telling me about a difference of opinion with your husband, and you seemed a bit uncomfortable about that. And then the next thing I knew, you were talking about a wonderful weekend you had. Did you notice this as well? And then you see if they notice it, right? And if they do, and there's any level of curiosity, you could begin to talk to them about how shifting in that direction towards the wonderful weekend, or even attacking him, made you feel a bit better. So in other words, because there was a difference of opinion, you see, there's the separation, believe it or not. That's how subtle this stuff is for someone who has these narcissistic sensitivities, that even a different opinion is enough to get them quite anxious about feeling rejected or slighted. So then instead of dealing with that difference of opinions and being able to talk about it, she goes off to what a wonderful weekend. So now that's part of a trauma bond too, by the way, because now you're in that illusion of just a blissful togetherness again. Yeah.
Right. Or like Melanie Klein calls it, the depressed state, right? When we just realize that we're just all mixtures of good and bad, and love is hard. And love is hard.
I don't know if you get into that at all. I did an episode on that, and I had to be really careful to say, this does not mean depression, because it's very different. It's called a depressive position, but what it really implies is someone who's living in a painful reality. Living in reality is not easy because people do have different opinions.
It's about living in reality, right? Not seeing this love as this illusion and this shared unconscious fantasy. And I also want to talk about, I had never heard this term before, and I love learning new terms. You taught me one. I think, is it anti-relating?
Oh, yes.
What is that? Yes. Can you explain that to us?
Oh, that is so, that's so important too. I may have been, I don't even know in what context I used it, but this is when I work with couples. Again, I hate to call them narcissistic couples, but both of them have these traits. And what you see is when there's this, just to stay with the example, when there is this disagreement, when there's difference in the relationship, sometimes this is close, and now I see why you probably picked up on this, right? Because this is closer to malignant narcissism. Because now there's an anti-relating, which is not just let me go off into an illusion of the wonderful weekend, but now it's a more aggressive attack on the other person for something that they've done to hurt you. And that's the anti-relating. Because it's not my term, just to give it full credit. I got it.
Who's it from?
I don't even remember right now. Maybe Steiner. Steiner is a British psychoanalyst, so maybe Steiner, but don't quote me on that. I'll have to look it up, okay?
That's okay. Yeah, it really struck me because in a trauma bond, the power dynamic, usually one person has the power and there is a power imbalance. And the pathological malignant narcissist, let's just call them that for easy terms, really does become dominant and cruel and abusive and even sadistic, honestly, in this relationship. So the power imbalance shifts, and that anti-relating term really resonated.
Yes. Well, you really did your homework. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast so closely. I appreciate the questions.
Well, listen, that's just the way. After you get a doctorate and you're used to research, I love to learn and do research, So I just found all your work very, very fascinating. And I want to give the ladies time to ask questions. But I also wanted to, I think this is very important. Can you give us the difference between, we know about cluster B, right? We have antisocial, borderline, narcissistic, histrionic, which we don't use as much. But the thing about borderlines, right, is that they usually do have much more of a capacity to change. And how would you describe the borderline? Can you give us a definition of how you would?
Yeah, I mean, we could go through this point by point, but just to sort of kick it off, I'll just go to the main distinguishing or differentiating characteristics. Since we're talking about narcissism, the main difference between the NPD and, let's say, BPD is with the narcissist. I mentioned earlier, the most important thing is the grandiose sense of self. Now, this is really important because this is a structure that develops in the mind that really holds together a fragmented sense of self. And you may have heard this concept before of splitting. When people go to like, everything is all great or everything is all bad, you're either with me or you're completely against me. So in all personality disorders, they have this fragmented sense of self. That's why the ultimate goal of treatment is what I consider to be integration, integrating split off parts of the self that get projected onto other people. So with the narcissist, they do have the grandiosity and it forms a little bit more of a cohesive structure. Whereas with the borderline, those who don't have comorbidity with narcissism, they don't have the grandiose self to hold them together. So what you see, in essence, what you will witness living with somebody, or if you know somebody like this, they're more quickly to oscillate between loving and hating, where the narcissist can be very dismissive. So a lot of the garden variety narcissist, if they feel slighted, they have the grandiosity. So they don't always even, they're like, your opinion doesn't mean anything. They could dismiss you and they could go on with their day because they think they're great and your opinion doesn't mean anything. But the borderline, however, they're much more fragile. See, they don't have that grandiosity. So what you do, even if you don't smile at them the right way, they feel deeply wounded. If you don't hold the door open, they feel deeply wounded. And then there's that quick oscillation and they begin to collapse. So that's the main distinguishing factor between the two is they don't, unless there's comorbidity, they don't have that grandiose structure to hold them together. And that's why the narcissist can do relatively well in life. They could have a job. They could be the CEO, right? They could be the president of like a major country. Whereas with the borderline, you don't typically see that, because they tend to decompensate more readily.
And when you said, unless there's comorbidity, meaning the person has both?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
People can have both.
Yeah, and what happens sometimes when I work with people who have MPD and they do engage in the treatment and they're with me for a number of years and we begin to analyze and dismantle the grandiose structure, sometimes initially what you begin to see is more of the borderline personality, begin to emerge because they don't have that structure anymore to hold them in place.
Yeah.
And it looks like they're getting sicker, but they're actually getting better.
Yeah.
The narcissist is harder to treat. In a way.
Right. So you see the foundation of the borderline. A lot of them have that. And then I'm going to ask one more question, then I want to go to questions for the ladies. What happens a lot with these pathological narcissistic men that we deal with, and you know this term very well, projection, but they feel they're big blamers. So let's say they feel frustrated. Let's say they feel disappointed. Let's say they feel anger or sadness. And because they have such a hard time of being with, right, containing their emotion because nobody did it for them, right?
Yeah.
So then they project it all out onto the woman and blame her. And they think that she's fully responsible for how they're feeling.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the biggest factors. In case you have anybody in your group, and even if they're not in your group, but you have anybody that you talk to who's always wondering, are they going to change? Like, should I stay? Should I go? That's one of the distinguishing characteristics right there is, can they even take responsibility for their own behavior? And then to what extent? And there are different levels of that. But yeah, that's where we started in terms of thinking about change.
They love this conversation so much. So Dr. Mazzella, what do you want to leave everybody with?
Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.